Samuel's fall. Samuel stared at his reflection in the hospital window, his face gaunt and his eyes distant. Outside, the city continued on, indifferent, but inside him, everything had stopped. Since that fateful accident, his life had crumbled like a house of cards. His wife, Andrea, had died on impact, and his two sons, Matteo and Lucas, lay in hospital beds, trapped in painful silence. He remembered clearly the emergency call, the confusion, the paramedics' shouts. "Mr. Munoz, your wife didn't survive the crash." Those words had left him in a void from which he couldn't escape. And now, days later, he clung to the hope that his children would wake up. But the doctors weren't optimistic. He had been a man of faith, believing since childhood. He prayed every night with his family, attended church every Sunday, and firmly believed in God's will. But now all of that seemed like a cruel joke. If God was good, why had he taken away what he loved most? His visits to the hospital became his routine. His business, a successful design agency, began to falter without his leadership. His partners, unable to manage the financial crisis, made desperate decisions. When he finally returned to work, he discovered the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. "Samuel, we did everything we could, but the investors pulled out. They sued us for breach of contract," his partner explained, a mixture of shame and desperation in his voice. Without income and with mounting medical bills, he lost his home. His car was repossessed, and little by little, he was reduced to a man without resources, without family, and without faith. The day he left his apartment, carrying only a suitcase and a few memories, he felt as if he couldn't go on. He wandered aimlessly, not noticing how the night fell over the city. He ended up sitting on a bench in the town square, watching people pass by, feeling invisible. "God, if you really exist, give me a sign, because I don't have the strength anymore," he whispered, though deep down, he no longer expected an answer. At that moment, an old man sat beside him. He had a peaceful gaze and simple clothes. He watched Samuel silently for a moment before speaking. "Son, it seems you're carrying a heavy burden. Sometimes, when everything seems lost, that's when we're closest to finding the way." Samuel looked at him skeptically. "I don't believe in paths or miracles. If God exists, he has turned his back on me." The old man smiled knowingly. "God never abandons us, even if we can't see him. Maybe tonight is the start of something new for you." Samuel didn't respond. He only lowered his head, feeling that for the first time in days, someone truly saw him, and so, unknowingly, began the journey that would change his life forever. The following days were a whirlwind of despair for Samuel. Every night, he slept on the streets, seeking shelter in doorways and dark corners. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders, and the faith that once held him had completely dissipated. One night, while wandering an alley in search of a place to escape the cold, a group of men confronted him. With threatening words, they demanded money. Samuel, having nothing to offer, was beaten and left on the ground, his face bloody and his body bruised. It was then that he heard a soft but firm voice. "Come with me, son." It was the old man he had met in the square. His name was Elias, a pastor who devoted his life to helping the homeless. He helped Samuel up and took him to a modest shelter, offering him food and a place to sleep. Still incredulous, Samuel accepted the help without saying a word. For days he stayed at the shelter, watching others who, like him, had lost everything. He listened to their stories, some worse than his, and wondered if there was truly any hope for him. One afternoon, Elias sat beside him and handed him a Bible. "You may not understand it now, but in these words, there is comfort and hope. When you're ready, open its pages, Samuel took it disinterestedly, but something inside him whispered that maybe it was worth trying. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, though he didn't yet know it. Days later, as Samuel spent hours looking at the Bible without opening it, he noticed a boy at the shelter. His name was David, a 10-year-old boy who had come with his mother, fleeing domestic violence. Despite their situation, David always smiled. One night, David approached Samuel and said, "Sir, my mom says God loves us, even when everything is bad. Do you believe that?" Samuel didn't know how to respond, but that night, for the first time, he opened the Bible, and he began to read. As Samuel read, he began to feel something he had forgotten: peace. The words resonated within him like an echo of hope. Each story of overcoming and redemption in the Bible seemed to speak directly to his heart. With every page he turned, Samuel felt his heart soften. The bitterness and resentment began to dissipate, and a small spark of faith was rekindled within him. He decided to attend the shelter's meetings, where Elias shared messages of hope. One day, while listening to a sermon on forgiveness, Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He realized he had to forgive not just God, but also himself. With tears in his eyes, he knelt and prayed for the first time in months. His journey of restoration had begun. Samuel continued to attend the meetings, gradually becoming more open to God's word. He listened to the testimonies of others who, like him, had hit rock bottom and found a reason to keep going. Despite his doubts, he began to help with small tasks around the shelter, serving food, cleaning, and listening to those who arrived with stories of despair similar to his own. One morning, Elias called him into his office and handed him a piece of paper with an address. "I know someone who might help you find work. It's nothing glamorous, but it's a start." Samuel felt a mixture of gratitude and fear. He had been lost for so long that the idea of going back to work filled him with uncertainty. But he decided to give it a try. The next day, he arrived at the address, a small carpentry business run by a man named Joaquin, who had also been helped by Elias to get off the streets. Joaquin greeted him with a smile. "If you're willing to learn, there's always work here. Don't worry if you've never worked with wood. What matters is the will." With trembling hands, Samuel took the tools and began his first day at work. It wasn't what he had imagined for his life, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was taking a step forward. With each day of work in the carpentry shop, Samuel began to regain something he thought he had lost: confidence in himself. He discovered a powerful symbolism in the wood. Just as a piece of wood can be transformed into something useful and beautiful, so too could he rebuild himself. In the evenings, he continued to attend the meetings at the shelter, becoming more active and sharing his story with others. Little by little, he began to see how his testimony inspired others not to give up. One night, while praying in silence, he felt a deep peace, as if God were telling him that he was on the right path. For the first time since the tragedy, he felt that he wasn't alone. His journey of restoration hadn't ended, but now he knew he had a purpose, and that filled him with hope. Months passed, and Samuel became a key figure at the shelter. He helped those who arrived with the same pain and hopelessness he had once felt. His heart, though still wounded, was slowly healing. One day, he received an unexpected call. It was his sister, Mariana. They hadn't spoken in years. After Andrea's death and the tragedy that had struck him, Samuel had cut ties with his family, feeling too ashamed and in pain to face them. "Samuel, we've been looking for you. Mom is sick. She needs to see you," said Mariana, her voice trembling. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know if he had the strength to go back, but something in his heart told him it was time to face his past. With Elias and Joaquin's help, he gathered the courage and took a bus to his hometown. When he arrived, he found his mother lying in bed, her eyes filled with tears when she saw him. "Son, I thought you'd never come back," she whispered weakly. Samuel fell to his knees beside her, taking her hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. Forgive me for disappearing." That night, Samuel prayed with his mother and sister. He felt that, although the pain would never completely disappear, God was giving him a new chance to rebuild his life and his family. After reconciling with his mother and sister, Samuel decided to stay a few more days in his hometown. He felt God was showing him something he didn't yet fully understand. One morning, while walking through the park where he used to play with his children, he ran into an old childhood friend, David, who was now a pastor of a small local church. "Samuel, I'm glad to see you," David said with a sincere smile. "I've been praying for you since I heard what happened." Samuel was surprised. "I didn't know you had gone into ministry." David nodded. "God called me when I was going through a very difficult time, just like you. Sometimes, darkness is the perfect stage to see his light." Intrigued by his friend's words, Samuel accepted his invitation to attend the church. When he walked in, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He sat in the back and listened attentively to the message that day. Faith is not about seeing to believe, but believing to see. As the words resonated in his heart, Samuel realized he couldn't keep running from God. For the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine desire to surrender his life and allow God to guide his path. When the pastor invited those who needed prayer to come forward, Samuel stepped up, his heart pounding. He knelt and whispered, "Lord, here I am. Help me find my way again." That day, Samuel felt he had taken a definitive step toward redemption. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he trusted that God had a plan for him. Samuel woke up early that morning, a light breeze flowing through the window of the small apartment where he now lived in his hometown. Weeks had passed since he reconciled with his mother and sister, and though his heart still carried the pain of his loss, he felt that, for the first time in years, he was beginning to find peace. The carpentry work had given him renewed purpose, and in the afternoons, after work, he dedicated himself to helping others at his friend David's church. But there was something within him that still felt incomplete, as if there was one more step to take. That day, while preparing for Sunday service, he received an unexpected call. It was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a familiar voice spoke. "Samuel, it's Mateo, your son." Samuel's world stopped for a moment. His heart raced. His son Mateo, who had been in a coma for weeks after the accident, was speaking to him. Emotions flooded over him,